Have you ever known somebody and you hang out with them and you're familiar with them and you know them and you have a casual way of communicating and talking to one another, and you think that you sort of your perception of them, that side of them, you're like, oh, I know this person, and then you go and see them in another environment, maybe even particularly in their elements, like if they have a job that they do or some space in which they're known, and then everybody talks to them in a completely different way in that environment, and you're like, oh, I kind of didn't know you at all. Or at least there's this whole other way that people see you and perceive you that I don't see. Has that ever happened to you? I shared a story a couple months ago about a time this happened to me. I'm going to share it again because it's just relevant. I was walking around many years ago now, but just down the street from here, actually, with a friend of mine who was an actor at the time, and we were I've known this person for years. And so, we're just talking, whatever. I've seen his highs, I've seen his lows. I'm like, oh, this guy, I know you, I know him. And as we were walking on the sidewalk, we bumped into some people and they were like, oh my gosh, because at the time my friend was on a reasonably well-known, pretty successful TV show, and they recognized him and started to, oh my gosh, it's you. Are you so-and-so on this show? Can we get your autograph? Can we take a picture with you? And just the whole time that it was just so interesting, because as I walked into that moment, I was like, I am on the inner circle, with this person. I know them really, really well. But then as soon as this other dynamic began to happen, I was on the outs in a weird way, because they were talking to him and about him in a way that I never would, because I'm too close to him. But also I saw a side of him that was hidden to me because of the way that they were speaking to him. It was such a strange and kind of weird, disorienting experience. But I got a sense for how this crowd viewed him and viewed the TV show and all this sort of, just by the way that they were talking about him. Because how we talk about people reveals who we think they are and how we feel about them. We just can see it right away in how we speak. Another area, as I was preparing for this sermon, where this happened to me, I remember being a kid and every once in a while going and visiting my dad at work. And your parents are there at home and you talk to your parents kind of however when they're at home. But when I went to work, and saw how people talk to my dad, I was like, I'm not sure we're talking to you the right way. I'm just kidding. We respected my dad at home. But there was a sense of people obviously, respect you, hold you in high esteem, and again, not that we did it, but you can just tell the way people are speaking. And I remember that as a kid going around and being people are speaking to my dad at work in a certain way that's just different from the familial, casual dynamic that exists in a home. Because again, the way that we speak about other people reveals both who we think they are and how we feel about them. Both of those two things are revealed, and they're two slightly different things. And on the one hand, when we talk about someone, we're revealing something about what we think their identity is. This is who I think you are based on how I'm speaking. There's a what of your identity that's revealed. But then and maybe even in a more important sense, the way that we speak about someone reveals how we feel about them and their identity. It's one thing to say okay, this is who you are. But then this is how I feel about who you are. I hold you in high esteem. I hold you in low esteem. You have my attention. I'm not giving you the time of day. All of these things are revealed in the way that we speak about people, both the what of who they are and the how of how we feel about them and how we esteem them. And I wonder what's revealed about who you think Jesus is and how you feel about him by the way that you refer to him. When you talk about Jesus, when you speak to him, what you call him, what does your language say about who you think Jesus is and how you feel about who he is? Your language just reveals it. It just comes out. In the same way that it comes out in all the other ways that we speak, your language is just the quickest way to the truth about who you think someone is and how you feel about them. What does your language and your speech about Jesus reveal about who you think he is and how you feel about who he is? What is revealed in your speech about Jesus, about those two things? These are the questions that we're going to be asking today. I've titled today's sermon, What Do You Call Jesus? This is a Palm Sunday sermon on Luke chapter 19, verses 37 to 40. If you have a Bible or a device, you could open up to this passage. I'm going to have the text up on the screen. I'm going to read it out loud as well. Again, the text is Luke chapter 19, verses 37 to 40. You already heard it wonderfully read by Sierra during worship, but I'm going to read it for you again, just to zero in on a particular part of our Palm Sunday passage today. This is what the text says. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Jesus answered, I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. The context of our passage today is obviously Jesus' triumphal entry. There's all sorts of context and details that I could give to you that help to round this out. Basically, what you need to know is that all the signs of this entry in the ancient context would have meant to people who are seeing this entry that Jesus is like entering Jerusalem in some sort of a royal way. You know, oftentimes in the ancient world, if you had won a big military victory over a neighboring nation, you would have some sort of royal entry into their capital city as a way to say, I'm the king here now, I'm the boss here now, I conquered you, whatever. And there are things about this. The donkey is actually a little bit, normally you'd ride it in like a war horse. The donkey is a little bit of a strange swap. That's, you know, a detail for another sermon. But all the other things here, the praising, the people, the palm branches, palms in the ancient world are associated with royalty and with victory. And so like all of the things sort of say here, some big important figures entering into Jerusalem, this important city. And during this time, people are calling out to Jesus and they're calling him different things. And the first thing that I want to look at today is the fact that the Pharisees called Jesus teacher. And the title that they use here is important. Why? I've just told you all. Because what we call someone reveals what we think about them and how we feel about them. And so they call him here teacher. And they're calling him teacher in relationship to something else that Jesus has just been called in the passage, which is what? King. So Jesus has been called two things here. He's been called teacher and he's been called king. Now let's zero in on the Pharisees for a second and what they refer to Jesus as. The text says the Pharisees are in the crowd, which there's a couple different ways that we can interpret this. A number of them sort of make me chuckle at the Pharisees because the Pharisees are around. They don't like, the Pharisees in this passage, right? They don't like the fact that Jesus is entering in this way. They don't like the fact that his disciples are calling him king, you know, all that sort of stuff, obviously. But it's like they're there. They're there, right? The text just says from in the crowd, right? Now we could sort of interpret that as something that's telling us something about the way in which they're calling out to Jesus. Like they're telling Jesus to rebuke his disciples from in the crowd. And so maybe they're like, we want Jesus to hear that he should rebuke his disciples, but we don't want him to know it came from me, right? The sort of like the weird anonymity that comes from being in a crowd, but wanting to speak in, but wanting to not be known. Maybe it says they're in the crowd to talk about the way in which they're speaking to Jesus when they say, you know, rebuke him, which that would tell us something about the Pharisees. Let's set that aside for a second and imagine that in the crowd just means the fact that they're there. Well, they don't have to be there. Or they could have chosen not to be there. If they didn't like what was going on, if they don't like what he's being called, they could have said, I'm not going to participate. But they wanted to show up, they wanted to be there, but for this weird, probably human mix of like a crowd's happening and also some jealousy maybe, but also like I'm going to find something to criticize because Jesus is probably doing something wrong. He's always doing things that are wrong from the Pharisees' point of view, and so he wants to criticize, they want to criticize him, and so they're just there. Well, whatever it is, the Pharisees are there. They like showed up. And so for whatever their motive is, it's probably something negative. They've showed up and now they're like putting this whole situation under the gun in terms of, you know, examining it and, you know, criticizing it and whatever. And of course they're there and they found something they don't like. They don't like the way that Jesus is being referred to. The disciples refer to him as king. When that text tells us, you know, that the disciples are saying, blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, you know, let's map on who they're referring to here. Blessed is the king. Who could that be? I don't know. Who comes in the name of the Lord? Well, that's God. Like name of the Lord, that word Lord is the English rendering for the Hebrew word for God. And so they're saying like, blessed is the person who comes in the name of God. So we've got God present. And then like, okay, who must the king be referring to? Probably the central person in the triumphal entry, Jesus. So when they say blessed is the king who's coming in the name of the Lord, what they're doing is they're calling Jesus king. They're saying, you're the king. You're right, and everything else about the triumphal entry says Jesus is king, except for the donkey, which we'll explain at a later time. But everything else says king. And so they say, blessed is the king. Blessed are you. Blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. And when the Pharisees hear that, they're like, something's wrong here. They don't like that. And they think that it's like inappropriate speech. They think that it's calling Jesus something higher than he is. And so when they come back to him and they say, teacher, rebuke your disciples, right? The rebuke your disciples part we often understand, right? That means I don't like what they're saying, right? Tell them to shut up. Tell them to stop saying that. They shouldn't be saying that, right? But the choice of the word teacher is particularly important because it becomes a foil for the word king. Now, Jesus in other places is called teacher, and he doesn't mind being called teacher in those places, in part because often when he's being called teacher, he's being shown to be the world's greatest interpreter ever of the scriptures. Right? And so in that sense, he is the great teacher. And he is he says like the Christ, he tells his disciples in Matthew, the Christ is the only teacher that you should have. And the Christ, he means me. So like he's fine in other contexts being called teacher. But in this particular circumstance, teacher is being used as something different from king. And what really is the issue at play here? It's about where authority is derived from. Because for king, the king derives their own authority. The king is like, I'm authoritative because I said so. The king is like the ultimate, like gets to play that mom and dad card over and over again, right? Like, don't do that. Why? Because I said so. Why? Because I'm the dad, right? It's like that infuriating, like logicless logic that just says like, I get to say it because like, no, I don't know, parents, we can push that button too many times, but there is something there that actually is playing on a right kind of authority where sometimes there are certain people in certain situations and certain roles in the world where their authority is self-derived. And so what they say goes. And kings and queens, monarchs are individuals, not constitutional monarchs, for those of you who watch The Crown, but every other kind of monarch, the real monarchs, your authority is self-derived, right? And so when they're calling Jesus king, the Pharisees look at that and go, no. The only being whose authority is self-derived is God's. And so you shouldn't be called king. Like if God showed up, we could call God king, but you shouldn't be called king. Maybe also in the ancient political context, they're like, Caesar's the king. And so we don't like you. And so we're going to, charge you of, sort of usurping the secular king's authority. They don't believe in that king's authority, but anything to get Jesus is fine. But the big thing is, God is king. God is the king. God derives his own authority. To call you king is to say something about you that is higher than what you actually are. And so they come back and say, teacher, because a teacher's authority is derived. Teachers can have some sort of, aura around them or gravitas or a lot of experience or whatever it is, but no one thinks that like teachers are just like have some strange magical well of self-derived whatever coming up in front of them. Teachers' authority is derived from, I had this experience over here and now I'm sharing it. So it's the experience that's authoritative and now I'm teaching. Or they read a particular book, I don't know, like the scriptures. And they're like, I can unfold the scriptures to you. The scriptures are authoritative, but it's not me. My authority is derived from the scriptures. So really what the Pharisees are saying are individual whose authority is derived. Stop your disciples from referring to you as though it's not. That's what's actually at stake here. And of course, underneath the derived authority question is the question, who is Jesus? Who is he? Like I said, all our language reveals who we think somebody is and how we feel about it. And here the Pharisees' language reveals that they think that Jesus is someone whose authority is derived, and they're pretty glad that it's derived, because if it were anything else, they would really, really, really dislike it. So we know everything that we need to know about how the Pharisees view Jesus from how they've spoken about him. You and I have to answer the same question in our own lives. What do we think about Jesus, and how is that revealed based on how we refer to him? Do you call Jesus teacher? And in what way do you call Jesus teacher? What do you call Jesus? Whatever it is, how do you refer to Jesus? And in what times and situations do you refer to Jesus in certain ways? And what does that reveal about how you view Jesus and how you feel about the being that you think he is in that moment? What should you and I call Jesus? The Pharisees show us one way to review Jesus and refer to him. What should you and I call Jesus? How should we refer to him? How should we view him? How should we feel about that? This text brings up the question of what do we call Jesus, and why does it matter for how we view him and feel about him and who we think he is? You may think, as I raise this question up for you, some of you may think, and this is very, very timely, that my child's screaming up in the upper room, that you can be silent on this question, but you can't. There is no silence to be had on the question of who is Jesus. There isn't. Jesus is saying many things in his reply to the Pharisees. We'll get at them. But one of the things that he's saying when he says, if these were silent, the stones would cry out, he's saying silence on the question of who I am is not an option. If these were silent, the silence would be filled up by something and somebody else. Silence is not an option when it comes to the question of who Jesus is. There are certain sorts of questions that come to us in our lives where silence in the face of that question is not an option. The examples that I'm going to throw out are strange examples that probably have never happened to any of you because they're such extreme sorts of things that we very rarely have them happen. But there are certain sorts of extreme questions that could come up to us where silence is not an option. We think that there are certain things that we can just kind of be agnostic about, right? Agnosticism is a popular option in the world today in terms of navigating the world and articulating your worldview for people who are, thinking people. And a lot of thinking people want to say, I can't know who Jesus is. There are a lot of ultimate questions about the world, and I simply can't know. I just can't know what they are, and agnosticism is the most reasonable position. Well, there are many positions for which agnosticism is a very reasonable position, except for a few questions within which agnosticism is just not a possible answer. Because there are some questions where you're either answering yes or no, no matter what you answer. So for example, if somebody were to, we have to choose a gender here. So we'll say a woman that you don't know, runs up to you on the street. I don't know, we'll say she's 20 to 30 years older than you. She runs up to you on the street and she goes, "Oh my gosh, it's you. I've been looking for you my whole life long. I'm your mom." I know. Insane situation. But let's imagine that happens to you. Someone that you don't know, that you've never met before in your life, comes up to you and says, "I've been looking for you my whole life long. I'm your mother. I'm your long-lost mom. We were separated at birth." And all the implications that come from it. Your real parents have stolen you from me. Or the parents you think are your real parents have stolen you from me, whatever. Now imagine you're hanging out with your friends later that day. You're going out to one of these low-lit brick rooms in Greenwich Village, and you're getting an overpriced drink, and you're like, "Hey, what's going on?" Whatever. And all of a sudden you go, "Yeah, someone came up to me today and told me that they were my mom." And, your friends are shocked by that and interrogating you about it. And they're like, "Whoa, my gosh, well, what do you think? What are you doing?" And you're like, "I don't know. I've just chosen to not answer the question." Right? That's the one response that you actually would not be able to do. You can't do it. If someone tries to pry open the question in your life about who your parents are, being agnostic about the thing is an insane response. It would open up the very foundations of your life in such a way that it just would be totally untenable for you to not answer the question. For you to sort of try to not answer it is for you to allow that person's claim to just have some weird authority in your life. I don't know now. I guess I don't know who my parents are. Maybe it's this person I met on the street. Maybe it's these people who, raised me and paid for everything for, 25 years. Whatever it is, it's actually not an option. And there are certain questions, I know that's a silly example, but a potentially real one, that we're if that were to happen to you, or if a similar question were to happen to you, that is that opens up certain foundational things in your life. To try to not answer the question is to pass a verdict on it. And the sorts of claims, let's imagine another one. Let's imagine somebody shows up and is like, "I'm the king of the world." Somebody shows up, so you pass somebody on the street, "I'm the king of the world." This gets close to the claims that Jesus is maybe making. Someone who's shows up on the street, "I'm the king of the world." Now you would not give them a time of day, but not because you're allowing their claim to live in some unanswered space in your mind. You would dismiss them so quickly because you're sure the answer is no. Right? If their claim maybe had a little smidgen of possibility of being true, it would change everything about the structure of your life. Because your political allegiances as they lie now would change overnight, right? What's this person's value system? What's their morality? You probably need to know because they're going to tell you a new way to live. Just thing after thing after thing would just fall out because there are certain kinds of claims that people make where there's no room for an unanswered answer. You either are saying yes or no by the way that you respond. And if someone were to stand on the street corner shouting, "I'm the king of the world," and you were to walk by and not give them a time of day, it's not because you're not answering their question or not answering their claim. It's because you're positive the answer is no. The sorts of claims that Jesus makes are not dissimilar from a seeming nobody standing on a street corner shouting out, "I'm the king of the world." And how you respond to him lets him know, I'm either saying yes or no to the claims that you're making. It's a certain sort of claim that cannot just be swept under the rug and passed by. Silence in the face of the question of who Jesus is not an option. And so you respond to the question of who Jesus is by answering any number of ways. And the world that we live in today answers any number of ways. Teacher is a really popular answer today. Again, not necessarily in the very positive way that Jesus uses it to affirm himself, but it's popular today to say Jesus is a wonderful ethical teacher. He may have existed, he maybe didn't exist. It kind of doesn't matter. What matters is that his teachings have gotten handed down over time, and they really are some of the most ethically superlative teachings forever. And if he died on the cross, his sacrificial death was an example to us of how we should lay down our lives for others. Jesus is a wonderful teacher. And that word teacher today, what it really is saying, because it sounds at first like, oh, he's a teacher. But what it really is saying when it's used in the modern world today is I'm relativizing about half of the claims that Jesus actually made. Right? What it means is I'm relativizing half of that, and then I'm left with like the few things that Jesus said and did over here that I feel comfortable with, affirming today. So teacher in that context, when we use that word to refer to Jesus in this way, what it really means is you're less authoritative than you say that you are, but you have some good stuff to pass down. And really, I'm the judge over you because I'm the one who gets to say what of the things that you said are true and not. That's how teachers often use today. Maybe you refer to Jesus as teacher in that way. Yeah, you're a convenient ethical teacher that mostly says things that line up with modern Western morality today. Wonderful, you're a great teacher. Another thing that people can do to refer to Jesus, an option, is to just say that he didn't exist. This has become harder and harder to do over the last, couple decades as people have really just deep dived the historical accuracy of the Gospels and then also the multiple extra-biblical references that exist to Jesus and the Jewish Roman historian Josephus and also Greek historians like Tacitus and probably Suetonius. So it becomes an increasingly difficult position for people to hold that Jesus didn't exist. But, when you have a couple like famous filmmakers make a documentary 20 years ago and then revive this, and there was a piece in the New Yorker that someone flagged to me where they're bringing up the idea again, maybe Jesus didn't exist, fine, whatever. You could say, who is Jesus? Non-existent. He's just a totally religious myth. And of course, if you want to answer his claims with that way, then you can use it to just totally set aside all the things that he said. It's a position that is increasingly difficult to hold for any reasonable thinking person because there's just, a number of places that we can go to now to see the evidence of who he was and that he was a historical fact and figure who made an impact on history, let alone engaging with the Gospels. But sure, people who want to get out from under the claims of Jesus can always lean into that, mostly not because the evidence is really there, but mostly because it was so long ago, right? The stuff with Jesus happened like 2,000 years ago. Anything that happened 2,000 years ago, I can kind of get away with saying it kind of didn't happen. Because it was just so long ago. Sure, fine, whatever. You can do that if you want to and turn your mind off and not engage with the questions about who Jesus actually was, because we actually have quite a bit of information about him from the Gospels and from extra-biblical documents that just let us know that he lived and walked and breathed and did some stuff. Another thing that we can say about Jesus, interesting, as I was preparing, I felt God bring something up for me to touch on this. We call Jesus friend. Jesus is my friend. He's my friend. That's wonderful. And let me be clear, that's biblical. Jesus says that we can call him friend. It's an incredible privilege that we call him friend. Sometimes, however, we use the language of friend in a way that maybe over time can become too casual, because we use the word friend to describe a real familiarity, a real sort of just day in and day out knowledge. And again, when Jesus says to his disciples, formerly we talked about each other this way, but now I call you friends, he is implying a casualness, a familiarity. All that stuff is true. But what we forget sometimes when we use friend and only friend over and over and over again is that in the Bible, when God allows us to call him friend, every single time there's just like this huge shock in the biblical context that we get to call God friend. Because everything else about the divine human relationship would say, you definitely don't get to call this being friend. And in fact, ancient philosophers went out of their way. Aristotle, in one of his works, goes out of his way to say, the one thing that you can't be with a God is a friend. It's like the one thing you cannot be. You can be any number of other things. You cannot be a friend with a God. Because a friend is such a relationship of equals and casual, intimate, ongoing stuff. And sometimes when we call God friend over and over and over again, we forget the fact that he's God. Every single time we call God friend, if we're using that word right and in a biblical way, what we should be saying, we should have a sense of, It is incredible that I get to call this person my friend. And when we start using the language of friend in a way that's divorced from that, where we're no longer going, this is incredible, but it's just common. But one thing, our reference to God through the word friend can never become as common. It should never become common that we call God friends. It can be intimate, it can be familiar, it can never be common because it's incredibly, if it's anything, it's incredibly uncommon that you get to call God friend. And God has done things, sacrificial things that make you able to call him friend. And so sometimes in the world today, we call Jesus my friend, but it's become too common. We've forgotten how shocking and transgressive it is that we should be able to call God friend. And so sometimes we're like, I call God friend, but what I'm really sort of saying is, this is someone who just is like really okay with me and everything about me in my life, and they never say anything challenging, and they certainly don't have much authority. They're just sort of my buddy. We're using the word friend to call God my buddy. God's not my buddy. He's my friend, and it's like incredible that God should have become my friend and given me the word friend as a resource that I can use to describe him. And every time we call God friend, we should have this weird sense of awe and trembling that goes through us as we remember, I was never, ever, ever able to call you friend until you let me. And now I get to, and it's amazing, right? All these things are options for how we can refer to Jesus and call Jesus today. And they all speak to things about who we think that he is. Maybe one place that we could go if we're going to answer this question, how should I refer to Jesus? What should I call Jesus? Is we should just say, what does Jesus think you should call him? What does Jesus think you and I should think about him? What does Jesus think you and I should feel about him? How should we refer to him according to Jesus' own perspective? And I want to zero in on a few words in this passage that we often rush past or look past. I want to zero in on them. They tell us a lot about what Jesus thinks about how we should refer to him. This is in Luke 19:40. Jesus answered the Pharisees, I tell you. If these were silent, the very stones would cry out. I tell you. I tell you. Now, we've talked a little bit about these various titles that we can use to refer to Jesus and the ones that the Pharisees used to refer to him and what they mean about authority. And in particular, Jesus has been called king, which is a being in a position that derives its own authority, self-deriving, and the Pharisees have relativized or tried to relativize Jesus by calling him teacher, a title that has derived authority. And so when Jesus answers the Pharisees, he's going to give them a response, sure, that helps to justify what's happening, but where is he going to get the authority for that response from? That is the question that we should be asking when we look at Jesus' reply. And Jesus doesn't say, the scripture said that God's king was going to ride in on a donkey, and that's me, so the scriptures say that it's right for my disciples to be calling me king. Jesus doesn't appeal to the authority of the scriptures. Who does he appeal to? Himself. He says, I tell you, on the basis of my own authority, it's right for these things to be said. He gives reasons for that. I'm going to come back to that. But on the basis of his own authority, he says, he stands up. He doesn't really stand up. Can you imagine him standing, kind of surfing on the back of a donkey? That'd be a wild thing. Maybe he did. I don't know. The text is silent on it. Let's imagine it. He stands up and he says, I tell you. I am telling you right now, when Jesus says that, he is standing up in his own authority and says, on the basis of me, not the scriptures, not tradition, not something else, on my own authority that is imbued in me because of who I am, I tell you it's right for these people to be saying these things about me. And so when Jesus says that, he is saying, you should call me king. They're calling me king. It's right to call me king. And if anyone's got any questions about it, I'm telling you it's right for them to call me king. And that circle is tied pretty tightly. There's nothing out there. There's no external appeals. There's no whatever. It's just they're doing it. It's right because I said so. It's just kind of that parent move. Why is it right? Because me. Because I said so. Because I'm the dad. Because I'm the king. It's right. And so you should call me king. That's what Jesus says about how you should refer to him. He says, you should call me king. You should call Jesus king. Now, it might be surprising for you to say, okay, I'm going to call Jesus king. A number of thoughts and feelings could be coming up for that. But one thing that I just want to point out here is that the word king just kind of feels far away from us today, because we, live in a political system where there aren't any kings. At least hopefully there aren't. We live in a political system where there aren't any kings. Listen. No political system is stable forever. It just isn't. So we live in a time of instability, and you have to decide who you're going to be in response to that. And hopefully it'll get more stable. I hope and pray for that. And maybe it won't. I don't know. A lot of people around the world have lived in times of political instability. And you and I can spend our time going, everything's getting unstable. Or we can spend our time going, who has God called me to be in a moment where things are getting unstable? You get to choose. And it's going to make all the difference between how you feel about yourself and your life and my sense of strength and who I am and what I'm contributing and what other people are getting from you. Like whether or not you're giving them anything helpful, anything that's blessing them, anything that's challenging them, anything at all. All depends on how you're going to choose to respond. One of those responses is mostly just about looking at the world and panicking. And the other response is about going, God's hand is on this. I don't know how. Doesn't mean I'm not engaged. Doesn't mean I'm not, standing up in my own political convictions and acting out. It just means God's hand is on this. And so he's called me to respond in these situations in a certain way. And it would be wonderful if we live just for forever in a politically stable time. But that is not for us to decide. It is for you and I to decide what we're going to do in the situations that God has put us in and who we're going to be regardless of the circumstances that we're in. You need to sit down and look yourself and God in the face and say, who am I going to be? So there you go. There's that for you today. What was I saying before I said that? Someone get me back on my train of thought here. Yeah, king. We hopefully don't have kings. And because of that, the word is just kind of far away from us. And so we're like, what am I doing here? Am I like, jumping into a monarchy like thing, like king, he's the king. What does king really mean? And there are a lot of things that we could say about that. Certainly it says something about authority. We've already said that it's not derived authority, it's self-authority. We're going to come back to this with creation, how that maps onto the stones crying out, a wonderful part of this passage. But there's a second thing that is apparent in the language of king. It's apparent all over the Bible. It's apparent when we look at kings and queens operating at their best around the world. The king has a particular power. It's the power to save. It's the power to deliver. Because the king has authority, the king has a ability to marshal power unto the right purposes at the right time to save. And this shows up all over the Bible when God's people were searching for a king. Primarily, they were searching for a king because they wanted someone who could save them, who could deliver them from political and military conflicts that they were in. So they said, we need a king to save us out from these sorts of things, from enemies at the gates. We need someone to be able to save us. And that basic instinct got rightly mapped onto God and the prophets who said, God is our king, and so God is going to save us. And so we have passages like Isaiah 33:22 that says, for the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our king, it is he who will save us. And it binds up together that imagery of king with saving, such that when we call Jesus king, what we're saying is, you are the one who has the authority and the power to save. That is what it means for Jesus to be king. It's what it means when we cry out, Hosanna. Hosanna means what? It means God saves. It means God saves. So for you to call Jesus the king is for you to say, Jesus is able to save, and he's able to save me. And Jesus is able to save you, and he has saved you, and you should call Jesus king. It's one of the main things that you should call him to, and to relate to him, not just because you're saying you have authority, not just because you're saying you have power, but because you're saying you are able to save, and you have saved me. Jesus has saved you and me, and when he comes into Jerusalem at the triumphal entry, he's on his way in to save. He knows it's going to cost an incredible amount for him. He knows there's going to be incredible pain. He knows there's going to be incredible loneliness. He knows there's going to be abandonment, and that he knows there's going to be an incredible amount of misunderstanding. People are going to think that he's lost and been beaten up and died in absolute failure, and he's walking into all of that because it is in the power of the king to save. Worldly kings have power to save just because they're able to marshal armies and worldly power and strength. Jesus is able to do that, of course. He says to Pilate, I could call down my angels whenever I want to. But Jesus is God's king. He's the king from heaven. And so he's the one who's able to marshal weakness and loneliness and pain and suffering and turn that into power to save. And that's why Jesus is able to save you no matter what you're going through in your life. And Jesus has saved you already if you would take on that salvation. Because when Jesus died on the cross, he turned weakness and loneliness and bitterness and tears and blood and wounding into power to save. And you should look at him and say, you are my king, because you've turned those things into power to save and power to save me. Jesus is your king. He's powerful to save, and he saved you at the cross. And as a result of that, that should turn you into someone who says and shouts out and cries out, I worship you. You are the king. Now we turn to the most famous part of the passage, right? If these were silent, the stones would cry out. Jesus is saying a number of things here. You know, really, when you read commentaries about this, there's a lot of different opinions on what he's saying. Because, I mean, just think about it logically. It's an if-then statement. If these were silent, then stones would cry out. That's all he tells us. He doesn't tell us what that means. He doesn't tell whether it's good or bad, right? There's a way of reading his if-then statement as sort of Jesus saying, like, have you ever heard a stone scream? It's not a pretty sound. If these were silent, it would just be all stones screaming, you know? I think that's probably not what he's saying. But again, I mean, he doesn't fully say. We have to interpret a little bit. This is one of the things I think that Jesus could be saying. Jesus is saying, I'm the king over creation. Creation is crying out my praise. And there's praise that's due to me in this moment from the creatures that are here. And if they would not take up their praise, some other parts of creation would come in and take it up. On the one hand, of course, that means that it's right that the disciples are saying what they're saying. But I think also Jesus is saying, if someone's created voice to praise me is silent, something else will take it up. Because creation is going to praise me. Because I'm the king. And so creation will praise me, and the only question here is who is going to take up the song of praise that God has given them to praise. If you call Jesus king, then God has given you a song of praise to sing. Don't give it to the stones. You sing it. All of creation will praise Jesus the King. He's riding into Jerusalem. He's riding into this space today. He's riding into this city to be praised. Creation will praise him. And it is an incredible, incredible truth that God has already given you authority over a slice of creation over which you can choose to add it or subtract it to creation's song of praise. It's the slice of creation called you. It's a slice of creation called Sarah and John and Aaron and Kate and Laura and Jeff. It's that slice of creation that has been named and apportioned under your authority. Are you going to say it in the voice and timbre and sound and uniqueness and stature that has been given to you through a creative hand of God to say it and to cry it out? Or are you going to give it to stones? Are you going to give it to rocks? Are you going to give it to gravel? Are you going to give it to any other thing that is going to come in and fill it up if you will not give back the created cry that God gave to you to praise? You should be jealous over the song of praise that God has given you to sing. You should be jealous over somebody else not getting to sing your song of praise. And so you should be people who look at this as Jesus' song of praise. You should be, there's probably is some overlap here about out of the mouth of babes and all these sorts of things where people, before we lose our innocence, before the world gets into us, we love to sing out the voice and the sound that God has given us. And who knows what is stopping your voice? Something. Fear, judgment from other people, wounding, a lack of confidence in the sound, the uniqueness of what I have to give. Let God break and remove all those things from you today. Let God bring you back into touch with the sound of praise that God has given you to give. Let God make you love again that sound. Let God make you feel confident in that sound. Let God make you stand up in that sound. Let God make you hold zealously the sound of praise that I was given to give back to Jesus, my King, to the God who saved me. And when that happens, every day becomes Palm Sunday. What a bummer that it's one day of the week, 1 week of the year. It's just a day when people stand up and say, I've been given a song of praise to sing, that Jesus is the King, and I'm singing it today, and I'm praising it today, and I love it because it's a way that God says, I've given it to you in the way that I've made you. I love it when I stand up in the way that God made me to be and give that back to him. All of these things are things that are on offer for you when we call Jesus who he actually is and then look at my own life and my own created nature and my own created sense and say, this is what God has given me to give back to him. It's unique. No one else is ever going to be given the exact song and sound that you've been given to give back to God. Give it back to him. Give it back to him. Love giving it back to him. Stand up and giving it back to him. Raise your voice to give it back to him. Do these things, and every day becomes the Palm Sunday that it should be, where Jesus comes in humble, riding on a donkey, and we look at him and we say, you're the king, you saved me, you turned weakness into power to save, and you've given me a song to sing, and I love singing it. Amen.